You've been told Pepi II ruled Egypt for 94 years in peaceful prosperity, the longest reign in human history, but the archaeological record tells a different story. One where 50,000 children vanished from the population registers, birth rates collapsed by 70%, and an entire civilization began its terminal descent into chaos. Right now, in museum archives across the world, there are administrative documents from ancient Egypt's Sixth Dynasty that record something historians have been reluctant to discuss. A demographic catastrophe so severe it ended the Old Kingdom forever. And at its center was a pharaoh whose reign didn't bring stability, but instead presided over the systematic breakdown of everything that made Egyptian civilization function. The numbers are there, carved in stone and inked on papyrus. But they've been sitting in academic journals for decades, while popular history keeps repeating the same comfortable myth about Egypt's longest-reigning king. Let me show you what actually happened when Pepi II took the throne as a 6-year-old child, and why the 50,000 missing children represent just the visible edge of a catastrophe that modern Egypt has never truly recovered from. Here's what we know for certain. Pepi II became pharaoh around 2278 BCE, ascending as a young boy after his brother's brief and suspicious reign. The traditional narrative celebrates this as the beginning of unprecedented stability, 94 years of continuous rule, longer than any monarch in recorded history. But administrative records from provincial governors tell a completely different story. In the first 20 years of Pepi's reign, birth registrations in Middle Egypt dropped from approximately 70,000 annually to fewer than 20,000. That's not a gradual decline, that's a population collapse. And it gets worse. Census documents from Elephantine Island show that between year 15 and year 35 of Pepi's reign, the number of children under age 10 recorded in tax assessments fell by 68%. 50,000 children who should have been counted, who should have grown up to be farmers and craftsmen and soldiers, simply aren't there in the records. They vanished. Now, before you assume plague or famine, listen carefully to what the evidence actually shows. There's no mention of epidemic disease in any contemporary inscription. None. Plague leaves evidence, mass graves, medical papyri, desperate prayers to Sekhmet for protection. We have extensive records from later Egyptian plagues, and the documentary pattern is unmistakable. But during Pepi's reign, nothing. No plague burials, no medical crisis. Instead, what you find are administrative letters from provincial governors complaining about something far more disturbing: the systematic breakdown of agricultural labor coordination, the inability to maintain irrigation systems, and repeated references to fields going unplanted because there weren't enough workers. One letter from the governor of Kusi to the vizier in Memphis survives, and it's chilling in its bureaucratic precision. He reports that his province can no longer meet its grain quota because the men are occupied with other labors and the women have ceased their productivity. Read that phrase again. The women have ceased their productivity. In administrative Egyptian language, that's code for a birth rate collapse. This is the part historians rarely mention. Ancient Egyptian society depended on a fertility rate of approximately 6 to 7 children per woman just to maintain population stability, because infant mortality claimed roughly half of all children before age 5. When you see birth registrations drop by 70%, you're not looking at a temporary crisis. You're looking at civilizational extinction mathematics. At that rate of decline within 2 generations, there wouldn't be enough young people to maintain the irrigation systems, staff the temples, defend the borders, or produce the agricultural surplus that funded the entire Egyptian state. And that's exactly what happened. By the end of Pepi's reign, Egypt had fragmented into competing provincial kingdoms, the central government had collapsed, and the first intermediate period had begun. 2 centuries of chaos, famine, and civil war that wouldn't end until the Middle Kingdom forcibly reunited the country through military conquest. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The demographic collapse wasn't random. It was concentrated in specific provinces and specific social classes. Analysis of tomb inscriptions from Pepi's reign shows that elite families, provincial governors, high priests, military commanders continued to record multiple children and grandchildren. Their birth rates remained stable. Meanwhile, tomb inscriptions for craftsmen, farmers, and lower-level administrators either disappear entirely or show dramatically reduced family sizes. The children who vanished were overwhelmingly from the working population, the people who actually made Egyptian civilization function. And there's evidence suggesting this wasn't accidental, it was the predictable result of policy decisions made by a central government that had lost control. Here's what the administrative papyri reveal when you read them carefully. During Pepi's long reign, corvée labor demands, the forced labor system that built pyramids and maintained canals, increased dramatically even as the population declined. Provincial governors sent increasingly desperate letters to Memphis reporting that they couldn't meet labor quotas because their available workforce had shrunk. The response from the central government wasn't to reduce demands. It was to extend the duration of corvée service and lower the age at which boys could be conscripted. Tomb biographies from provincial officials record proudly that they delivered the youth to the king's work at ages as young as 8 or 9. Child labor wasn't supplementing adult workers, it was replacing them. And when you force children into hard labor instead of allowing them to grow, learn skills, and eventually form families, you're not just exploiting one generation. You're eliminating the next. The evidence becomes even more disturbing when you examine what happened to women during this period. Egyptian administrative texts typically record women by their productive roles: textile workers, bread makers, beer brewers, agricultural laborers. During the first half of Pepi's reign, these occupational designations appear regularly in taxation documents and work rosters. But starting around year 40, a new category appears with increasing frequency: women classified simply as attached to the estate without specific productive function. Egyptologists have debated what this means, but the linguistic analysis points to something grim. These were women who were no longer economically productive because they were too malnourished, too sick, or too exhausted from consecutive pregnancies to work. The demographic pressure to restore birth rates led to women being forced into continuous reproduction, while simultaneously being denied the nutrition and rest necessary for their own survival and that of their infants. The result was predictable. Maternal mortality skyrocketed and infant survival rates plummeted. You can see it in skeletal evidence from cemetery excavations. Remains of women from Pepi's reign show significantly higher rates of pelvic fractures, spinal damage, and bone lesions consistent with severe calcium depletion, the physical signatures of malnutrition during repeated pregnancies. Now understand the machinery that made this possible. Ancient Egypt wasn't a decentralized society where families made their own reproductive decisions. It was a bureaucratic state that tracked births, registered children for future labor obligations, and controlled access to food through a redistribution system centered on temple granaries. When the central government decided it needed more workers to maintain its monumental building projects and irrigation infrastructure, it had the administrative apparatus to enforce that decision. Temple records from Pepi's reign contain references to breeding assignments for women in state workshops, literally administrative orders concerning who would reproduce and when. The state didn't request children, it demanded them. And when mothers and infants died because the system pushed human biology past sustainable limits, those deaths were simply recorded as administrative losses, not moral failures. The 50,000 missing children weren't kidnapped. They weren't sacrificed. They were never born, or they were born into conditions so brutal that they died before their first year, or they were worked to death as child laborers before they could reach reproductive age. The demographic collapse wasn't a mystery. It was policy. And Pepi II didn't cause it through malice, he caused it through something worse: bureaucratic inertia combined with a complete inability to recognize that the traditional methods of Egyptian governance had become catastrophically unsustainable. Here's the evidence that makes this undeniable. Pyramid construction continued throughout Pepi's reign. His pyramid complex at Saqqara required millions of man-hours of labor. Meanwhile, irrigation canals were failing. Agricultural productivity was declining. Provincial governors were screaming for relief, and the central government kept demanding more labor for monuments instead of redirecting resources to the infrastructure that actually kept people alive. We have the work logs. We have the grain distribution records. We can calculate exactly how many calories were being diverted from feeding farming families to feeding construction crews building a tomb for a king who would reign so long that by the time he finally died, there weren't enough skilled administrators left who remembered how the government was supposed to function. The long-term consequences were civilizational. The first intermediate period that followed Pepi's death lasted over 2 centuries. During that time, Egyptian population probably declined by another 40 to 50%. Monuments were abandoned, cities shrank. The literary tradition nearly disappeared. When the Middle Kingdom finally reunified Egypt around 2050 BCE, it had to completely rebuild the administrative state from scratch because the institutional knowledge had been lost. And the demographic hole left by Pepi's reign never fully recovered. Comparative analysis of skeletal remains suggests Egyptian population didn't return to Old Kingdom levels until the New Kingdom, 1,000 years later. One pharaoh's 94-year reign created a demographic deficit that persisted for a millennium. Read the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a Middle Kingdom text that describes the chaos of the first intermediate period. The land is deprived of kingship by a few irresponsible men, Children of nobles are dashed against walls. Women are barren and none conceive. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. This was documentary evidence of societal collapse written by someone who had watched it happen. The text explicitly connects the collapse to the failure of the previous government to maintain basic functions: food distribution, justice, protection of the vulnerable. It's a direct indictment of the late Old Kingdom administration, which means it's an indictment of Pepi's 94-year reign. But here's what makes this story so important for understanding how civilizations actually collapse. It wasn't war, it wasn't plague. It wasn't climate catastrophe, though there's evidence the Nile floods became less reliable during this period, contributing to agricultural stress. Egypt fell because its government became so rigid, so committed to traditional ways of doing things that it couldn't adapt when conditions changed. When the population began declining, the rational response would have been to reduce labor demands, redirect resources to supporting families, allow provincial governors more autonomy to manage local crises. Instead, the central government doubled down. More pyramid building, more corvée labor, more demands on fewer people, until the system broke completely, and the children paid the price. 50,000 documented disappearances from census rolls. Probably hundreds of thousands more that were never recorded because rural families in the Delta and Upper Egypt weren't consistently counted in official registers. An entire generation that should have existed, that should have inherited farms and workshops and traditions, just gone. Replaced by demographic void that guaranteed the civilization's collapse. This changes everything we think we know about the Old Kingdom's end. The standard narrative treats it as a mysterious decline, a gradual fading of central authority. But when you examine the administrative records, when you track the population data, when you read the desperate letters from provincial governors, what you see is something much more specific and much more preventable. You see a government that had the information, had the resources, and had the administrative capability to respond to a demographic crisis, and chose instead to continue business as usual until business became impossible. The definitive truth is this: Pepi II's 94-year reign wasn't a testament to Egyptian stability. It was a slow-motion catastrophe that destroyed the most successful civilization of the Bronze Age. The 50,000 missing children weren't victims of plague or famine or war. They were victims of administrative failure, of a government so focused on maintaining traditional power structures that it sacrificed the future for the present. The demographic collapse wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, made not through malice but through the more insidious combination of bureaucratic inertia and the refusal to acknowledge that old solutions weren't working anymore. If you've learned anything from this investigation into ancient Egypt's greatest demographic catastrophe, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're going to keep uncovering the uncomfortable truths that traditional history prefers to leave buried in archives. The machinery of civilizational collapse is always more mundane than we want to believe, and the warning signs are always visible to anyone willing to read the records carefully. So what uncomfortable historical truth should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.